Welcome to another episode of the Digital Native Podcast, where we talk to tech leaders about what they're building and learning. Our guest today has been a Techstars mentor. He was the founder of Cloudability, which was then acquired by Apptio. He's now the executive director of the FinOps Foundation and co-author of the O'Reilly book, Cloud FinOps, Collaborative Real-Time Cloud Financial Management. That's J.R. Storment. J.R., thanks for joining.
Hey, Ryan. Thanks for having me here. Good to be doing this.
Yeah, so great to talk to you. To get started, I think it's great to take us back and tell us a bit more about your background, how you got into technology originally.
Yeah, sounds good. And in the COVID times, disclaimer, I'll say that I'm sitting here with two dogs and my family's not here. So if they start making noise, I may have to kick them out halfway through. But my background started, I grew up in Hawaii, of all places, and really got into technology. My parents got a Commodore 64 in the 80s, right around the time that we moved there. And I was kind of like the only person in the family who could figure it out, did anything with it as a kid. And so kind of grew up, just hacking around on that. And I later, my first gig was actually at the WM Keck Observatory, which is in Hawaii, the world's largest optical observatory there. And I got like a summer intern job, basically doing like tape backups and computer inventories, some of them at the headquarters and some at 14,000 feet on Mauna Kea at the actual observatory itself. And during that process was kind of like this was like, the mid 90s. I was doing like web design on the side, figuring out HTML. I was in high school taking classes, in some of this stuff and really, fell in love with just building stuff online and figuring out how to do that. And, in that gig, I made a pitch to them to let me switch from just doing tape backups and inventory to actually like working on their website and their intranet and really kind of cut my teeth doing that there, and learned how to sculpt and curate things in order to present them online. And funnily enough, after I went to, and I'll get maybe a longer story later, but I went to college for a year at Portland State University here, and I actually dropped out, and I tried to go back to that job at the Keck Observatory, and my boss actually refused to let me come back because they were like, it was an academic facility, and they were like, we really think you need to get the education. And so they like, if you're not going back to school, you can't have the job. So I was like, okay, well, what do I do? And I was like, 18 at the time. And so I basically hung out a shingle doing, web development in Hawaii. And in the 90s, that was like, it was boom times, like tourism was going crazy. The Japanese tourism market was really hot. And so did that for like 7 years there, building websites and platforms and e-commerce, built a team of 6 or 7 folks, basically like servicing the tourism industry and real estate and, airlines, and basically went as far as we could go in Hawaii. And then for about 7 years of doing that, I had some realizations. I sort of had a quarter life crisis. I was 25 and realized I didn't actually love the sort of grinding out of consulting work and the hustling of that, and really realized that I kind of in some ways was not exactly a technologist as much as I liked using technology to build stuff, build communities, build projects. So ended up chasing a girl to San Francisco, selling my house, selling my car, and kind of started working for bigger companies there, Charles Schwab's and Sotheby's. And after a few years, realized that what I wanted to do was build larger projects. And so got into the startup life about, I guess 12 or 13 years ago, and started building SaaS platforms.
And that leads kind of to Cloudability. I mean, so Cloudability was founded back in 2011. I first heard about the company in 2013. Techstars did a series called Startup Stories, and they had this video. And I think I watched that video. I was sitting at my current role. I watched the video. I pulled up, got online, and I applied like on the spot. And I was kind of sold from that video, and I was like, this is what I want to do. I mean,
I interviewed you at some point, didn't I?
Yeah, and the strange thing is I was actually in Hawaii for the interview. You were in Portland. I had no idea you were from Hawaii at that time.
That's right.
Yeah, and I've told Matt Ellis this story. I went through kind of the round of interviews, and at the end, he went out to shake my hand, and he said, I hope you make the right decision. And I ended up not taking the job, but it turned out okay. But at that time,
ominous. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. But at the time, I mean, I thought it was such a cool company, kind of a new wave of Portland tech startups. Take me back to kind of the days. What's the story of Cloudability? How did you guys end up in Portland?
Yeah, the story of Cloudability is hard to answer because there's like everybody's got a different story, right? In the founding story. But I mean, from my end, I had just gotten to Portland in 2009. Had just sort of failed my previous startup and had a this was late 2010. My wife was in her first year of med school. I was trying to figure out what to do after reeling from the startup failure. We had twin boys on the way. My wife was pregnant, and I got invited to speak at this little meetup in Southeast Portland. I think it was called Continuous Web. Group of like 15 people who got together in like literally somebody's, living room off like Southeast Powell and 30th something. And I was there speaking about the story of this previous startup. And in the audience was Matt Ellis, who I had never met before. And he was fairly new to Portland and, had come there after doing a bunch of startups and tech jobs in the US and the UK. And he was kind of trying to figure out what to do too. And he was like, consulting. And, he really liked the story that I told of that company and how we built it and the learnings that we had. And he and I just kind of hit it off and started looking for ways, to work together, doing, startup beers and doing some projects together. And it was probably 3 to maybe 6 months later. I'd met Lucas Carlson, who was the founder of what was PHP Fog and then AppFog. They got acquired by CenturyLink. And he had told me the story of how he had basically raised like $2 million as a sole startup founder, but with no product. This was like 2010. And he basically had put out a landing page to promote what he was doing and make it look like he had a product and get traction and then go raise money approach. And I had this tea with him also in Southeast Portland. And I got so excited by this concept of like what I had always done in the past is like, you got to build the thing and then launch it. He was like, no, you promote it, you make sure there's a market. And then if there is, you build it and go raise money. So I just happened to have a meeting with Matt Ellis a few blocks from there right afterwards. And I sat down and I'm like really caffeinated and telling him the story. And he's like, that's really cool. That's really cool. And he says, like, I got this idea I've been kicking around called Cloudability to like manage the cost side of cloud. And, do you want to like build a landing page for it? And my first thought was like, that sounds like a really boring company and concept, like cloud costs. And man, I don't know. But, at the same time, I was like, this guy's a rocket ship and I want to work with him. And like, if he's gung ho on it, I think it's going to go. So I looped in another friend of mine, Alex Bilmes, who later was the CEO of Reflect that got bought by Puppet Labs. And we started building a landing page. Matt looped in our original co-founder, John Frisbee, who is our sort of rocket ship initial, tech lead. We started the journey and, go into whatever parts of the journey you want, but 9 years later, I think, what's really cool to look back on is that, Matt was phenomenal going out there and selling the vision and raising funds. I think he raised over $50 million over the course of the time. But what was really cool was at the time when we sold the company, and I remember him reaching out to me, sharing this right after it happened, is like over 400 people in our community like benefited from the sale of that company, right? So we just got amazing opportunity to learn through the process, to grow, to work with, so many talented people, really like waves of family almost, right? And it's so funny, like I recently had Doug Gould, who was one of the early hires, I think way early, like 12 or 15. He's at AWS now, over for outside socially distanced conversation. And, I was telling him about somebody else who had joined years later and he didn't overlap. And I had this realization. I was like, oh, right. Like there's all these different generations of Cloudability family. And it was a great learning experience and, really grateful to that chance meeting with Matt at that meetup.
Yeah, I think there was some sort of joke where I've heard people talk about, urban jive ship trends or, everybody in Portland, it's such a small community, has kind of come from the same group or tribes of companies, which is really interesting to see the overlap.
We had so many urban people and jive people came in and it was cool. I mean, in some ways to watch that progression of Portland startups, right? It was like when we were 3 people in Pi, the Portland Incubator Experiment, like Urban Airship was 12 and they were upstairs and, Puppet was like 25, 30 people. And, we were just kind of following the footsteps of these giants over time.
You mentioned something interesting too. I've heard an internal Googler talk about this concept of prototyping. And I think it's really similar to how you took your company to market and, see if there's a market there, advertise it as if you have it. And once you feel, once you find out, is there a need or not, then you start building. It's such a smart, different way to go to market.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the guy who I think sold the most book copies in this is Eric Ries with the Lean Startup, right? But the book I read before that, I think Lucas may have turned me on to, is Steve Blank's The Entrepreneur's Guide to Customer Development, and his whole thing is like it's all about confirming the market, confirming the need, confirming the pain. Set of questions, set of stories, and then using that traction to go out and build the right thing. And I mean, it paid off. I mean, we ended up with I think it was July 10th, 2011, we had a New York Times article before we had ever really built a product or shipped anything, because we were really selling that vision, and that helped us, really get started with the traction.
How has the cloud evolved from that time early on? Has it kind of exceeded your expectations for growth? Is it what you expected?
Yeah, I mean, I got introduced to the cloud building my previous startup on Wowza servers on EC2, streaming video, because we were using another platform that was too expensive, and somebody told me about this thing called AWS and started messing around with it, and realized how hard this challenge was. It ultimately was the company we built because my previous startup, we blew through all this money that we didn't mean to, and realized it was really hard to manage this financial portion of it. But I think when we were starting, Matt was always years ahead, and he's always like 5 years ahead in his vision of like, this is going to be huge. Cloud's going to be thing. It's going to, go multi-cloud. It's going to be underpinning where enterprises are innovating. And at the beginning, it was really a question, at least for me, coming into it, like, well, is this really going to be as big of a thing as it is, right? And then, kind of got to the next stage of the coming years, and it's like, okay, cloud's really going to be a thing. Okay, well, which cloud? I mean, I remember when we started, we supported like SoftLayer and Rackspace and SliceHost and these early providers who, at the time still thought they had a horse in the race against, AWS and ultimately Microsoft and Google. And then early on, our big spenders in cloud were $30,000-$50,000 a month of cloud spend, right? And that blew my mind. It's like, wow, in a quarter, somebody could buy a house. In the end, the companies, that we, ended up working with, companies spending $300 million a year, right, in their single cloud provider, $1 billion a year across multiple cloud providers. And when I say cloud, I'm literally just talking about infrastructure as a service, right? So the scale of how it has evolved has been amazing, and I think the ubiquity that it's hit now has been really exciting to see.
What are some of the customer stories that you can share that demonstrate the impact that Cloudability had, and what it's done for customers?
Yeah, I think speaking a bit to the evolution of what this space, and not the cloud space specifically, like the cloud financial management space that we worked in and I work in now as part of the FinOps Foundation, is like early on in the journey and in the maturity of the space, like a lot of people looked at this space as like, well, it's about saving money. It's about cost savings. And I remember like our early meetings with AWS initially, and then later Microsoft and later Google, where we were thinking, well, are they gonna like us? Are they gonna say, whoa, you're making people spend less in cloud? Like that's gonna hurt our business. But ultimately, what as things evolved and we realized through our customer work, and they realized, is that the space of cloud financial management is really about enabling better business decisions by having like the data and visibility into why you're going down this technology choice, or why you're investing in this platform, or what you're doing. And so I think, over time, it's really evolved to be, how do we help enable companies to make decisions about where to invest the right amount of money, not necessarily to invest less. And the best stories are always the ones about, using the savings, if you have them, to reinvest. Countless stories of companies who've, basically said, hey, we've saved $1 million here. And Ibotta was one that comes to mind. We did a story with them a few years ago, but they saved $1 million at these low-hanging fruit over here, and they reinvested that into building new data product to drive additional revenue, right? And that's really the power and promise of this type of space, is making those choices. And then because cloud enables innovation, not just innovation, but it allows you to try new things and to spin up projects and be okay with failure, right? In that same startup model, like old days data center, you wanted to test a concept, you had to deploy hardware, and there's just some cost against that. And if you bought it, you now own it. Cloud, what's been amazing to see is, big enterprises starting to go down that path of, oh yeah, we can operate like a Pinterest, right? And spin something up real quick and see how it works, knowing that we can tear it down later. And it's sort of like moving cloud from just a data center replacement to an innovation driver has been the most exciting thing to see.
Well, I think it's ironic because cloud in general, a lot of folks looked at it and they said, oh, it's a cost saving play. You can do it better, more efficiently, and what people have started to come to realize is, no, it's not. It's an innovation play to what you're speaking. Is, if I can come out with a product 3 times as fast as you can with half of a team, because they're only working on our core competency, I mean, it's really an innovation play, and the landscape is changing so quickly with companies, popping up out of nowhere and other companies going out of business. It's
Exactly.
moving quicker than it ever has. So take me now to the FinOps Foundation. It's something I know that you've put a lot of work into. How did your experience, I guess, at Cloudability prepare you for this venture? And tell me a little bit more about the foundation.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe I'll kind of combine that into a little bit of my own journey at Cloudy and how that sort of led me there, which was, my initial role was when it came into the company was the sort of the non-CTO, non-CEO founder. So I kind of picked up everything else, right? I did product marketing and sales early on. And then, later as we had customers, I moved into customer success and built that out. And then, later helped build out our international expansion. And, for me, my focus throughout the path was always around like the customer pain. I was very tied into what was happening there. Great, to that like lean startup approach, the Steve Blank sort of books. I was always focused on how do we get really close to what's happening with them so we can build the right products. And one of the themes that I kept seeing come out, was the real change that our customers were going through was not just this move to cloud in terms of technology or CapEx to OpEx financially or anything else. It was actually the way that cloud like really broke down the existing power structures in the tech org and moved the procurement process out of procurement finance into engineering's hands, and broke all the models of like financial allocation and chargeback, and suddenly created this environment, just like DevOps did before, where you've got to have teams come together who didn't actually previously work together or didn't know how to. Finance teams are not just reporting and doing retroactive; they're partnering with the engineering ops teams to figure out where to invest money, right? And spending is variable, and if you stop spending it, you stop paying for it. But then you need to figure out how to allocate that and all these things. And so we would have within Cloudability our customer advisory meetings, customer advisory board, to bring together our big customers to essentially say, look, here's our roadmap, right? Here's where we're going. Do that dog and pony. And invariably, about halfway through those meetings, folks would sort of stop listening and want to turn to the customer next to them and like share the stories of, okay, I know this is how you use the technology, but like, how did you get your CFO on board with this move? Or like, how have you structured your team to bridge that gap between engineering and finance? Or, how are you thinking about chargeback? What have you figured out for your tag strategy, your label strategy in GCP? And so it hit upon us very much that, there was a bigger thing at play here, which was this cultural transformation. And I hate that term, but it actually worked in the enterprise that was happening. And so, we looked at sort of how to support that as a thing, which is the space of, and it's been called cost optimization or cloud economics or cloud financial management, you name it, and really realized that there was a hunger in the space to codify the best practices and really to pull together a community around this. So, we had the idea of spinning this out at the time. Working with a great guy who was our head of marketing named Jay Wampold, who had done a similar process at Chef when they were sort of building out their DevOps community. And he encouraged us, right, to think of this as a community and less a marketing play and less of a, this is for your customers. Like this needs to be a space that there's a place for people to come together in. So January 2019, I was still working in London, building out our EMEA offices, and was looking at some of the things like Cloud Native Computing Foundation, who's done great work to build the cloud native community and Kubernetes community, and realized that we really needed to build this as a nonprofit sort of trade association. So we spun up an entity for that and started in February of last year with 26, I think, initial members who were practitioners in this space, who were coming together to share their stories and their knowledge and their best practice. And it's in the last 18 months, it's really very organically just sort of exploded into, we got over 2,000 practitioner members from, I need to run the numbers and maybe I'll follow up with you, but I want to say we've probably got 300 at least of the Fortune 500 who are in there, as well as, pretty much name your tech unicorn who's plugged in, anybody who's working with cloud at scale. And this group has come together to basically share best practices, create a community, foster that innovation and help those who are new in this journey, start the process in their own companies.
Yeah, I think you have an interesting pulse into organizations working with all those. One question I have for you is how do you balance innovation and cost optimization? Any stories or any companies that you've seen do this really well?
Yeah, it's challenging. I mean, it feels like it's a pendulum swing typically in organizations. It's tied to budgets and how well they're doing, and it's also tied to who the tech executive, or tech leader, CIO, et cetera, is at the time, who the CFO is. Typically, companies don't really think about the cost optimization bit when they're moving to cloud until they hit what I like to call a spend panic moment, where things hit some threshold where somebody in the C-suite gets very concerned about it. Cloud's not typically the biggest IT line item, but it is the most variable and fastest growing for a lot of companies. So, that balance starts to come in where there's initially usually a huge cost optimization push, and people sort of do that and they say, okay, we've got it under control now, and they go back about their business, and then there's a swing again. The balance comes in where companies start to think about, to think of the iron triangle. It's like, do you want it good, fast, or cheap? And you've got to make decisions on a workload by workload basis, and time by time and company by company basis about where to invest, right? So you can't really do that until you've got all the people at the table, right? The business people, the finance people, the tech people. You've got good data and visibility into the impact of those decisions, and critically, which I think is working with an amazing amount of large companies and tech unicorns who they're not really having the same people look at the money coming out of spending and also the money being spent, and looking at the business impact of cloud spend. So really that's the magic of it, is getting those things together so you can start to make those decisions and say, yes, we're gonna invest heavily in this production environment that's customer facing to make sure it's fast, and has the best data science behind it, driving personalization. But we're going to really optimize over here in this dev environment, right? That is part of our R&D expenses that we do want to focus more there. And it's about creating that conversation so you can make those decisions consciously instead of just letting them happen.
I love the example of that triangle: good, fast, and cheap. From what I've seen, oftentimes the executives you hire to run a company all are focused on one of those things. Yeah. And so bringing, that whole team together to really understand the end vision and the goal can be challenging. I had Henry Schuck on a couple of weeks ago, who founded DiscoverOrg, now called ZoomInfo. And he talked about, his job as a CEO is aligning everybody and get them all to focus on the vision and understanding, how what they're focused on impacts that greater vision. Yeah. And just kind of made me think of that. So in terms of stories or folks that are involved, have you seen any specific companies or team members that are doing this well?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch. I mean, it's always an interesting mix of the big enterprises. Like I just did a training session with a lady who runs FinOps at Fidelity named Jen Hayes. They've done it for a big enterprise. They've done amazingly well, not only with managing a big old financial sort of company move over, but also taking advantage of things like spot instances and things that are more advanced sort of startup type of company approaches. I would say two companies that also that would come to mind for this conversation, though, both Google customers, would be LiveRamp in San Francisco and Spotify. Just did a session at KubeCon with LiveRamp's head of ops, and they told a great story where they had like a data center meltdown a few years ago and did this like really fast move into GCP. And the first year or two was really focused around all the tech learnings and the exciting new innovation and tooling they could use, et cetera. All the stuff you hear about at Google Next or at AWS reInvent, and everybody's talking about, look at this cool new database technology. But they hit that spend panic moment where they were like, oh, we've moved fully in and we didn't think about this at all. And their SVP of finance was like, oh, you've got to get this under control. So he pointed them at some of this FinOps concepts, and their ops team, who was like a SRE engineering focused team, really leaned in, and they started to see the connections. They actually took one of the trainings that Mike Fuller, who's the co-author of the Cloud FinOps book, gave last year, and they saw the connections of which we love to see when engineers lean into this, of Agile and DevOps, and this idea of iterative, fast improvements, breaking down of silos, collaboration. And they were actually, of any of the companies I've worked with in the last year or two, were able to really put in a quick process. I mean, that was the structural change about getting accountability pushed out to the teams, budget ownership, improving that relationship between finance and engineering, getting accountability, and to the point that I think is really hard for organizations. It's getting engineering teams to be thinking about cost as a first class metric that engineers need to consider. And that happens the best when that expertise and that push comes out of, as it did with them, I think in engineering org, it was under their CTO, and they were able to sort of evangelize that. Another great, GCP customer that's, I think a big marquee for you all, right, which is Spotify. they've shared a bunch of good stories in the foundation. Anders Hagman, who interestingly is on the other side, he's a tech procurement guy who leads this in Spotify, although he works in engineering org, about how they've done work to help engineers understand the impact of their actions on the business by doing things like, hey, let's look at and they have, you can go Google GCP and Spotify and see the massive numbers that they spend on you guys. Some of that's publicly reported. But their engineers were struggling to understand, okay, this giant number, what does that really mean? And if I go take this much action, how can I impact that? So Spotify did work to do things like, let's present our spending to the engineers in terms of engineering person months, to say, this infrastructure change you're going to make actually is 3 years of engineering person months, and if you can tweak it by this percentage, we could actually go hire 4 more engineers on your squad who can help do this. So this will have a material impact, this cost optimization process, on not only the business but also your life. So some really good work by those, and there's hundreds of others in the foundation in there we could share about. But I always love, that's one of the hardest things, is getting the engineering teams on board. So those are the stories I like to share.
And I love that, making it relatable, person months. I saw one of my favorite presentations that I've ever seen on this topic was by Spotify, and they broke it down and they were talking about beers. Like, we shared with the engineers, we were like, this is how many beers we're saving this month.
Yeah.
And just made it so fun. It became this great culture thing. And, the whole engineering team was focused on saving beers, and then they'd go out and celebrate. And if you look at, some of the numbers, the financial numbers, and how efficiently they ran, I mean, it's incredible kind of what they've done. They called out Google Cloud specifically, as an innovation partner and as an optimization partner.
They called it, this was pre-COVID days, they called it, I think it was flattening the curve, because they had their spend was going up and they wanted to flatten that. And then, they were able to very successfully do that.
And they have so many cool stories. I mean, from the way they do personalization, they came up with personal playlists, and the way they're using Google's analytics stack, to really target and make a personalized special experience.
They're a great example. I remember hearing stories of them at some of the talks saying, we decided to invest into personalization and data because that drove revenue, right? And that was where we did want to double down. We wanted to choose good rather than cheap.
Exactly. And that's the power. And it's applicable to every business with customers, so it's going to be fun to see how other companies start to mimic and create experiences like that for their customers. So I want to turn the conversation a bit more personal. Last thing on the FinOps related, is there anything that you're excited about, both with the foundation and kind of with the space?
Big question. I think everybody's kind of struggling with the same stuff. It's like, how do we allocate costs, particularly shared costs? How do we get that engineering responsibility? How do we align this move? The move from CapEx to OpEx always comes up, but it's really the shift from fixed cost to variable cost, and the behavioral change that accompanies that within the organization. So, I think, the things that I'm excited to see the space and our entity tackle in the coming years is really, we've done a lot of work around community up to date, but we're now, as part of the Linux Foundation, which we joined this year, we've got a strong open source push. So we're trying to codify a lot of the capabilities, the KPIs, the best practices, the ways to think about these things, and starting to see contributions from the community come into that, so that we can help people sort of not start from ground zero with it. Some of the interesting, I think, forward-looking things that are coming. The shared cost aspect is definitely a big thing that I think a lot of people are trying to solve. Cost and spend visibility in Kubernetes is a real challenge that seeing some really interesting companies in the space start to pick up on as part of that. I think really the next frontier, though, is really there's not a lot of the stuff we uncovered in the book, which is all from stories from people like the GCP customers we mentioned and others at AWS and Microsoft, was really not about the technology or even the cloud financial management processes, but how to get that cultural change and the communication happening between teams. So if you've got this optimization recommendation, how can there be a conversation around that, and how can it be attached to business value and business process? So I think there's some interesting companies coming out, and a lot of things can go around how do we encourage that level of collaboration, a layer sort of on top of the analytics. So excited to see where that goes in the coming year, and just really to scale this thing out so we can take it from a group of 1,000 enthusiasts or 2,000 now to truly an industry standard over time.
That's great to hear. And moving a bit more personal now, and want to talk about kind of your experience as a tech leader and founder.
Yeah.
Were there any leadership skills for you that maybe didn't come naturally or took you more time to develop? And what have been some of your biggest challenges as a tech leader?
Totally. I think For me, like it's a blessing and a curse. Like I'm a generalist. I like to get my fingers in, all sorts of things. And this means that it's hard for me, I think, to really scale myself in a lot of ways. And I've talked to other tech leaders, like their founders in particular, who are like, I want it to be done a certain way, right? And I want to plug in and make sure it's just right. And I've got enough knowledge in each of the areas, but I'm not a specialist to kind of do that. And that in some ways can make a good leader, because like you can talk to, people in the company in each of those. But I've found over the years, I've really struggled to sort of, get myself out of that and to scale into the processes. And so one of the things I've kind of had to learn is about, well, letting go of things, but also before I do that, getting the right team around me. So, I found like the first hire I always need to make is like an operator. If you follow like DISC profiles, which is the Myers-Briggs work version, Matt Ellis actually turned me on to these. Like I'm really high D, which is like I want to lead, and I'm really high I, which means I want to like be out there pitching and promoting and selling, but I'm low on S and C, which means I'm bad at keeping the same process going. I'm bad at detail. I'm bad at like things that don't change a lot. I want it to be quickly changing. And that's great to get things started, but you need somebody who's high S&C to come in and like help build the process, scale it out, make it something that can go beyond a small group. So, I found that it's not something that I'm good at doing. So I always try and build a team around me that can support that. And I think that's the big thing with any of these. It's like recognizing that as a tech leader or founder, like, you got your strengths and you got your weaknesses, and you're not going to be able to fix those weaknesses as quickly as you can, find complementary people to help, be a team.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And fill in the gaps. Where have you failed as a tech leader? Any specific stories or things that come to mind when you think about your time at Cloudability?
Oh man. So many. I think, there's this interesting confluence of trying to build a culture, which I think we did really well. And I've heard so many good, feedback and stories over the years about people who were just really enjoyed working there or wanted to, saw it from the outside, wanted to come in. And then, also being maniacal about getting the right people in and letting them go when they weren't necessarily the right fit. I think what I learned personally over the years is like the needs of a startup evolve so quickly year to year. It felt like every 9 months we're in a different company. I needed to let things go faster because it had scaled beyond me. In some cases, a lot of cases, there were people who we kind of kept on for too long because they were great before and we were close to them, but weren't the right people anymore for that spot. And we ultimately realized, this is probably not the best thing to say on a Northwest Tech podcast, is that it was hard to get really high level executives, right, in Portland, for example, right, particularly around go-to-market functions. So we ended up having a lot of our execs in Seattle, in the Bay Area, those types of things. And I think that's the big question mark that Portland needs to figure out, is like, I think where in this Northwest community is like how to scale a company in that and how to then integrate in higher level functions at other areas. Because I think we initially thought, we're going to do it all here and have this tight knit team, and realize that, the skills that we and some of our early people had early on were not necessarily the skills that we needed, when we got to a certain scale.
I read recently, I just came back from paternity leave, so I was doing more reading.
Right.
I read Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things.
Right.
And it's a big thing he talks about is, you need to hire for what you need in the next 12 to 18 months, not for what you need 18 months from now, because they're very, very different things when you're talking about the life of a startup.
Totally.
So going back, towards the end of Cloudability, it was special for me. I got to come in and do some work around BigQuery with the team. Having interviewed, almost a decade prior and following the company from that time was special to me to kind of be a part of that. You wrote an article last year called "It's Later Than You Think," which went viral. Had I'm imagining millions of views. Walk us through that article, a bit more of the story and what you've been reflecting on for the last year.
Totally. Yeah. So in May 2019, we sold the company to Apptio, and instead of leaning back, I personally kind of doubled down and actually had moved back to Portland. I was in UK building on our team, and then moved back to my home in Hawaii, working remotely, where I grew up. And
It was hard to keep track of you that year because
Yeah,
every time I talk to you, you live somewhere else.
yeah, so 3 months later, one of my twin boys died, and I was sitting the day that it happened in a conference room in our Portland office, talking with a group of like 20 managers about PTO policies of all things, and I was actually had just shared sort of like, haha, balance and all that, but I honestly hadn't taken more than a week off contiguous in the entire run of the company. I think I'd done that twice, full weeks. And then I got a phone call literally 2 minutes later from my wife saying that our son had died. Suddenly overnight, died in his sleep, just didn't wake up. So, my world imploded, as you can imagine. I literally ran out screaming out of the room on this call and went home and, found him and saw him there, and you can read the details in the post if you want. But it changed everything for me in terms of what was the focus of my work and the focus of my life. And, the first few months, as you can expect, we didn't really do anything but sit at home and cry and drink too much and, try and get our worlds back underneath us. And when I decided that I needed to come back to work, I decided I wanted to come back into something I knew. So we came back and joined Apptio, working within the Cloudy team, and had planned to do a smaller role, and I had gotten on a call with Sunny, the CEO there, about kind of what I wanted to do, and had laid it out, and he was like, well, you could do that, or you could come run our business unit for cloud. And I sort of like went, shit, this is something I wanted to do before, but it's really not where my heart is. And I mistakenly took it, I think at the time, because I came back into this work world, and long to your question here, but realizing that my heart was not really in the level of work that I previously had done, right? And realized that the world of startups that we had lived in, and I think most of the people I know lived in, required you to pick like one or two things, right? That iron triangle is a good metaphor. I mean, if you want to be successful in a startup, you got to lean into it. If you want to be successful in a marriage, you got to lean into it. If you want to be a good parent, you got to lean into it. If you want to take care of yourself, you got to lean into it. You can't pick 3 or 4. And I had thought that I could. And going back after my son's death made me realize just that I needed to pick, at the time, family and myself, and really spend time with my living child. It's definitely shifted. And it's been about a year now, almost to the day, about 3 weeks past a year. This is actually the year since I wrote the article. And I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like, that balance for me, right? And I think, to the point of that article, and it did oddly go viral. I wrote it because I had gotten on the phone with the co-founder or the co-author of our book, and he didn't want to ask. And I was like, well, if you're not asking what happened, like, I'm sure all the other people are wondering. And so I wrote it for my sort of colleagues to explain, where I went, and it did. We ended up getting picked up kind of all over the world. We ended up a bunch of news things, and they had Dr. Oz invited us on his show to talk about, what had happened to him. And what was really like cool and touching, I guess, is like the silver lining that came out of that was just the level of outreach that we got from people saying like, look, I was thinking about taking this job, and I realized it was going to take me away from my family, right? And I decided not to do that, or I'd move back, to be closer to, whoever it is. And I think I needed it, and I have so many regrets about not realizing this sooner, but it's really easy to get caught up in the excitement and the career and the whatever it is you're working on. And time is short. Time is very short. And regrets are strong when you don't take that time. And I know very few people in this space who have navigated that well. And so my encouragement to all of them is to, really think about, put yourself in the shoes that I went through and my wife went through, and look at the schedule of your day to figure out where you're spending time, because it's likely not where it really matters, and you likely will regret the time that you are spending, when you no longer have it.
Yeah, and I admire you for writing that. And I mean, I read it pretty quickly, twice. I'm a parent of 3. I had seen you, with your family outside of work, at the park here in Vancouver. There was like a Hawaiian festival, I think, last year. And I was wearing my Cloudability shirt, which was pretty ironic.
So, Ryan, I'm sharing my screen here. I have a photo from that day that I just found this morning.
Oh, you're kidding me.
No. So I don't know if you can see my screen, but so this
There
is my
I am.
screen. This is July 29th of last year. He and I had just gotten where it was a hula show my niece was in, and there you are in the background wearing a Cloudability shirt. So
I'll tell you, I'm wearing the original Cloudability shirt, which I think there's only a few thousand, that has the awesome logo on the back. We cover your SaaS. But yeah, I mean, my family gives me a hard time with how much I have so many Cloudability shirts, and I've worn them all over the world. So I have pictures everywhere. But yeah, and then I actually spent time with you and your wife kind of the weekend before all this happened. So I've seen you, with your family outside of work, how big of a part it is of your life. What kind of message, I guess, do you have? And you shared a lot of it to parents, to people in tech, or just others, given your experience and kind of what you've been reflecting on.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I think about conversations I used to have, like in Techstars as a Techstars mentor, one of the questions I always wanted to ask founders, because I was kind of grappling with this myself a bit, was like, okay, what kind of company do you want to build, and what like lifestyle do you want? Because you can be like, I want to build that $1 billion thing, or I want to raise, however many tens or whatever millions of dollars. And that's fine. And there's a lot of fun things and learnings and experience and big potential outcomes from that. But that is your life. Like, you get on that VC treadmill at that level, that is your life. You cannot have balance. I mean, the number of tech executives I've known over the years, or close friends, who have shit relationships with their kids, or are divorced, or, are a shell of themselves outside of work is staggering. Like, it's not, I think, possible to give a venture stage company what it needs and also have that balance. So I think there's an early conversation to have with yourself and, with your family of like, is that what I want? Or do I want to build more of a lifestyle company that gives me some of that balance? I mean, a few months after my son died, I was at the coast with my sister, staying in this house, and was just talking to her about all the regrets I had of like, not stopping post-acquisition to have the last few months, leaning into this other role that ultimately, like, I just couldn't do because my heart wasn't there anymore. And I told her just like how the regrets were almost stronger at that point than the grief. And I was also asking her like why she had delayed her career for 20 some years while she had kids and like didn't work. And she's like smarter than I am, and actually finished college and all these things. And she she looked me dead in the eye and she was like, I have no regrets about time that I spent with my kids. She's like, I was there through everything. I missed my career, but I was there for every moment. She was like, they're grown now. Now I'm like restarting my career. Mm-hmm. And it floored me, right? And I was like, wow, yeah, I don't have that. And and it's not to say like you stop everything and you just spend time with your kids or family, but in my experience for myself and those that I've worked a lot closely with over the years, that perspective is not there. And there's a sense that I'll get to it. And for me, this is one, you talk about failings and startup and learnings as a founder, like that sense of like, okay, when I get to this stage, when we get to this many sales or this many people or this many whatever, or when we get acquired, then I will slow down, then I will stop, then I will spend time. You hit that milestone, there's always the next biggest milestone, the next. And, imposter syndrome I have is a big thing around founders. There's a constant, like, I need to prove myself. I need to get to that next level. And that is a treadmill that just never stops, right? So there's a point at which, and hopefully you don't have to go through something like my wife and I did, and my son, but it's an evaluation process that I encourage people to look at really heavily right now.
Yeah, no, it makes me think of just starting with your why. Why am I doing all this stuff? What am I after? And you spoke to perspective and how important that is. I heard a CEO of a tech company the other day talking about perspective at home, and he's like, this experience has given me a chance to understand and learn more about my team and my customers, because I'm learning about, what their home looks like, their families coming onto the screen. And I was just like, man, what an interesting, positive kind of spin on things right now. And then he started talking about, your kids. And, I last week was thinking I have 3 kids under the age of 7 and younger. And some days I'm just like, man, we're trapped. We're trapped with our kids. And, starting to spin that and say, this is special time that we might not get otherwise, where I'm not traveling. I'm not, commuting on the road. I'm not going back and forth to Portland every other day or every day. And really take advantage of that time.
And that's, one of the concepts I've read a lot about recently with life philosophy and I think it's some ties to Buddhism teachings, but around just like negative visualization, right? And we're stuck at home with our kids, but what if the kids weren't there? Or what if as a lot of people today are not able to work and not able to work remotely, right? And are struggling to pay the bills, right? And the people in our industry, I think the tech industry, we're massively fortunate that I think largely COVID has not affected a lot of us financially because we're able to keep working. And I think, look, we went through an acquisition and, that provided us some financial cushion. At the same time, my desire to go chase the next thing has not subsided. And my friend, Alex Bilmes, who I mentioned earlier, is the CEO of Reflect and is now at Puppet acquisition afterwards. He, after I stopped and was starting this foundation thing, he was like, why are you doing this nonprofit thing? You need to go build a company, you need to focus on your career. And it's like, if I was evaluating it through the lens of my career, you're right. This is not the thing, but there's another dimension to consider. And so often, we as tech people, and particularly as founders, only evaluate it through that lens. So,
Well, thanks for sharing. I know that story has had a positive impact on me in my life and many others in the community and across the globe. A couple more questions I want to get that are kind of more personal and just picking your brain. What advice do you have for young tech employees who are just getting started?
Yeah, this is probably through the lens of my own, because it worked out well for me. But skip college and go to coding school would be good. I didn't go to coding school, but we ended up hiring a bunch of folks from there. I think the idea of, if you want to do tech, I was into business, computers, and theater were my three things that I really liked in college. And I realized all three of those are things that were better to go learn on the job than it was to necessarily go be academic about it. And so get into a startup. I think optimizing on the team that you're joining versus the product. It doesn't matter if aren't fully in love with the space, fall in love with the team and what you can learn from them. For me anyway, personally, I found moving around different roles is really important to kind of find the right fit, staying on focused as much as possible with the customers and the problem. And then I think one of the things that a lot of conversations with people in my teams over the years and is people figuring out what they want to be when they grow up in the company. Do you really want to be a leader because you think you're supposed to go do that? Or do you want to be a really high level IC, a principal engineer or something like that? And figuring out to that point of what's important to you, because companies need all types of folks at all different times. And there's no really right or wrong path. It's really what's going to both make you the happiest, give you the best balance, and let you contribute, to what the company needs as well. So realizing that there's a lot of paths to take, and the best experience is going to be, trying those out in an actual startup.
That's great advice. The smartest person I've met at Google he happens to work here in Portland, doesn't have his college degree. It's a guy by the name of Kelsey Hightower.
Oh yeah.
And I remember, and when you meet somebody like that, or yourself, and you start to rethink the way things should be done. Who are some folks here locally in the business or tech community in the Northwest that you admire or look up to?
Frankly, I kind of left the Northwest tech community in 2017 when we moved to London. So my people are going to be from earlier on in the journey, I think. First person that really impacted, and ultimately Cloudability wouldn't have happened if I hadn't happened to meet this guy. And the introduction he made was Chris DeVore, who's part of Techstars and Founders Co-op up in Seattle. He made early connections. He didn't invest in us, and I still give him hell about this every time I see him. But he declined me on 2 different companies. He made early connections that to Portland Incubate Experiment, to Puppet and Luke Knies, to Rick Tarosi, all these people. And Luke Knies was the guy who kind of gave us our start, gave us our first office space in Portland. We were just 3 guys. And Puppet was tiny. Those folks, just the openness of the community to bring us in was really helpful. I would say, and I left the company earlier this year, but Sunny Gupta, who's the CEO of Apptio, man, as a guy who's taken a company from 2 or 3 people to public and private equity and scaling, they're 1,400 people or something now, and is still totally plugged into the business. I think it's a huge respect for somebody like that who has been able to do that transition, bridge those gaps to all different stages, and still be, massively at the helm of that type of company. I think, a lot of respect for people who can pull that off. Looking forward to getting plugged back in now that I'm back in Portland. I mean.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to work a little bit with Sonny and was really impressed by his professionalism and his focus.
Yeah. And as a guy who's like made it, right? He's gone public and sold his company and is still just as driven and, passionate as ever.
Last two questions. What's something folks might not know about you outside of work?
Yeah, we kind of touched on that one, which is I for a long time I was afraid to share that I didn't go to college, didn't finish. I think education is super important depending on what you want to do. My focus, as I mentioned, has always been around kind of those things, which is computer science, business, and theater is the other side that I sometimes feel is like I grew up in the theater, loved doing it. It was like always my pastime, never wanted to be a career. But I found that type of work actually, it kind of prepared me a lot for business. It's like getting on stage, doing presentations, like improving through conversations. Like it's the yes and that is the improv concept that's applied. And I think very much in business that, where you're supporting and collaborating with others. I mean, I think, for me, it's a little bit liberating now to be able to share that. And in fact, I'll go a step further. I actually have a GED. My dad went bankrupt when I was going to a private high school, and I had to leave it in Hawaii. And so I have very little formal education. And I think I'm sharing this to say that for a long time was scary for me to share. And perspective of having some success in the space has helped. And also of losing my son has helped me realize that most of the things that we're really afraid of and most of the things that we get really stressed over don't really matter, right? I'm on a journey right now of trying to be more open and honest about who I am and not just have the facade that we all think we need to have in business. And I think that's the life I want to move into now and the people I want to work with. And when I go back into startup land, I want to be around others who are also on that journey. So encourage everybody to think about how we can, bring more of our whole selves, to the work that we do.
Well, JR, I'm looking forward to seeing what's next for you. Matt Ellis, he always said with Cloudability, JR brought the cool. So very cool of you to do this interview. I appreciate it. If I'd like to learn more about your work in FinOps and the FinOps Foundation, where should I start?
FinOps.org has everything there. Have to make the pitch. If you want to read the book, Cloud FinOps, O'Reilly, that's on Amazon, or just shoot me a note. I'm JR at FinOps.org. Happy to have a chat.
All right, great. And I'll include the links of those in the comments. Thanks again, JR.